I am one of those people who grew up on television. For 4 years, I was Laurie Partridge of the Partridge Family.
Susan Dey kept something hidden for years while filming the Partridge Family, and it had everything to do with David Cassidy. On screen, there were the picture of teenage innocence, but behind the scenes, a much darker story was quietly unfolding. What she concealed wasn't just emotional, it was deeply personal. When the truth finally surfaced, it changed how fans saw the show forever. This wasn't just a forgotten TV drama. It was a secret that revealed the true cost of fame and betrayal. Susan kept it concealed on the set, and what happened behind the curtain of America's favorite TV family was far from the wholesome image it projected. In the early 1970s, television families were everything, and the Partridge Family was a phenomenon. With its bright colors, catchy songs, and a wholesome single mother leading a band of talented kids, America couldn't get enough. The show had charm, charisma, and just enough comedy to keep things light. But beneath all the glitter and good vibes, something far more complicated was simmering off camera. While fans were singing along to "I Think I Love You," they had no idea how fragile the harmony on set really was. David Cassidy became the face of teenage stardom almost overnight. With his feathered hair, tight pants, and effortless swagger, he was adored by millions. Girls fainted at his concerts, magazines couldn't print enough posters of him, and his voice was everywhere. But inside the studio, Cassidy was just another cast member, one who had to share scenes with his on-screen sister, Laurie, played by Susan Dey. Their chemistry on camera was undeniable, even though it was meant to be strictly sibling-like. Behind the scenes, however, that chemistry wasn't quite so innocent. Susan Dey was only 17 when she began working on the show, shy, thoughtful, and completely new to Hollywood. Thrust into fame before she had time to process it, she found herself working beside David Cassidy every day, and that had a profound effect. She developed a quiet crush, one she never made public, not to the cast, not to the crew, not even to Cassidy himself. She masked it well, never letting on that each shared laugh or scripted hug stirred something deeper inside her. But others noticed. Shirley Jones, who played their mother on the show, later wrote in her memoir that Susan was crazy about David. Cassidy, however, didn't return the affection. At the time, he was swept up in the frenzy of fame, often distracted by the attention of fans and the lifestyle that came with it. Susan, meanwhile, kept things professional. She did her job and kept her feelings to herself, letting the crush quietly linger in the background. The cast seemed like a second family, at least on the surface. But like any group forced to spend too much time together, cracks eventually began to show. David's ego grew with his fame, and a noticeable detachment from the rest of the cast began to form. Susan remained polite, but a distance had settled between them. Even then, no one fully grasped the emotional weight she was carrying. To the world, they were perfect TV siblings. But in reality, Susan was enduring the silent pain of one-sided affection, smiling through scenes, hiding her heartbreak, and pretending everything was fine. And as David's fame skyrocketed, her feelings were pushed deeper and deeper into silence. By the time the show ended in 1974, what had once been admiration had hardened into quiet detachment. But that silence wasn't just about unreturned love. There was something else, something she never revealed publicly. What really happened behind the scenes didn't just hurt her, it stayed with her. Long after the music stopped and the laughter faded, the emotional scars remained. Susan Dey's secret wasn't just about a teenage crush. It was about the hidden cost of navigating love, fame, and rejection under the unforgiving spotlight of Hollywood. Playing Susan Dey left her with something she never wanted the world to know, and it wasn't the kind of secret fans would expect. It wasn't about fame, scandal, or any backstage drama the tabloids could dig up. It was quiet, invisible, and deeply personal. Susan Dey had a secret crush, one she buried so well that even those closest to her never saw it coming. While teenage fans around the world screamed for David Cassidy, someone just a few feet away was screaming too, but in silence. Unlike the girls in the crowd, she had to stand beside him every day, memorize lines, smile for the cameras, and act like none of it was real. But it wasn't just a fleeting crush, the kind people have and forget. For Susan, working next to David Cassidy was a constant emotional challenge. She watched him enter scenes with ease, charm the crew, flirt with extras, and carry himself with a natural confidence that couldn't be taught. He was bold, magnetic, and unpredictable, everything Susan felt she wasn't. That only deepened the feelings she tried so hard to hide. Off-screen, David was living the rockstar dream, dating models, staying out late, and dominating headlines, while Susan stayed quietly out of the spotlight. Despite being surrounded by fame, the person who knew him best during those years wasn't a screaming fan or a celebrity reporter. It was the girl who sat beside him every day, pretending to be his sister. Susan told no one about her feelings, not her family, not her co-stars, not even Shirley Jones, who played their TV mom and had a front-row seat to the quiet emotional drama. Shirley only put the pieces together years later. Susan stayed silent, afraid to complicate things. She was dedicated, professional, and didn't want her emotions to interfere with the chemistry that made the show successful. But emotions don't follow contracts. And the roles she was playing, on and off screen, became harder with each passing day. There were moments, small, seemingly innocent ones, that chipped away at her self-control. A laugh that lingered, a scripted hug that felt too real, a glance that wasn't in the lines. These were the things Susan would carry with her long after the cameras stopped. They meant nothing to David, but they meant everything to her. Eventually, David caught on. He wasn't oblivious. But instead of responding with kindness or care, he distanced himself. Not out of cruelty, but because his world didn't leave space for subtlety. He brushed it off, kept things casual, and acted like nothing was happening. Susan understood the message, even if no words were spoken. Whatever she felt, it wasn't mutual. Still, she kept showing up. She smiled with the cast, hit every cue, sang every song, and never broke character. But something shifted. The way she looked at David changed. The admiration turned to hurt, and the hurt settled into quiet resentment. One she never spoke about, not even years later. When fans asked why she seemed so emotionally detached from her time on the Partridge Family, they couldn't see the truth. It wasn't just about outgrowing a role or moving on from a show. It was about surviving a chapter in her life that hurt far more than it helped. She didn't want to revisit it, not out of shame, but because it was still painful. While the world clung to the image of a picture-perfect TV family, Susan Dey was still carrying the emotional weight of those years, something no one ever saw. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And when the cameras stopped rolling in 1974 and the cast went their separate ways, for fans, it was the end of an era. But for Susan Dey and David Cassidy, the real story was only beginning. With the set dismantled and the cameras no longer rolling, the emotional barrier Susan Dey had built over the years finally began to crumble. She was no longer Laurie Partridge, and David Cassidy was no longer her on-screen brother. The unspoken tension that had once been stifled by scripts and sitcom smiles was now free to breathe. During those quiet, post-show months, Susan and David reconnected. Without the weight of daily filming and cast expectations, perhaps Susan believed there was finally space for something real to unfold, something she had quietly hoped for all those years. She had buried her feelings for so long, maintaining a professional facade, and now she had a chance to see whether any of it had meant something to David too. They went out just once. But that single evening changed everything. David Cassidy later wrote about their date in his 1994 memoir Come On, Get Happy, Fear and Loathing on the Partridge Family bus, describing the experience with a cold detachment that made it clear he had never truly cared. He admitted to sleeping with Susan, but not in a way that suggested intimacy or connection. Instead, he reduced it to a casual one-night stand, something forgettable, even uncomfortable. He wrote that Susan simply wasn't wild enough for him. Those words, printed publicly for the world to see, crushed any remaining hope of friendship or understanding. For Susan, it was more than personal betrayal, it was public humiliation. She had spent years protecting their reputations, keeping her emotions quiet, never confirming anything or creating scandal. But David didn't return that grace. He exposed a deeply private moment, reducing it to something trivial and worse, laughable. That night, for her, wasn't just a failed connection, it had been a final thread. And with his memoir, David cut it loose in the most careless way possible. After the book's release, Susan reportedly cut off all contact with him. She avoided cast reunions, skipped interviews about the show, and refused any public acknowledgement of their past. While her career continued, something inside her had fundamentally shifted. The soft affection she once held for David was replaced by disappointment, discomfort, and a quiet pain she never discussed openly. Shirley Jones, their on-screen mother, stayed diplomatic. She acknowledged the tension, never took sides, and simply said that Susan had been hurt. That, for most, was enough to understand her silence. Fans noticed too. As the years passed and reunion specials aired, David and Shirley would appear, but Susan was always absent. Her absence became a statement. Whatever had happened between her and David wasn't something she could simply laugh off for the cameras. The experience had left a mark, not one that faded with time, but one that hardened into quiet resentment. Susan Dey had once kept her feelings for David Cassidy deeply hidden. But now, what she kept to herself wasn't affection, it was something far more complicated. Though tabloids speculated and Cassidy told his side of the story, Susan never publicly responded. She let her silence speak for her. But behind closed doors she had words that revealed what she had truly been holding in all those years. And those words weren't gentle. The truth was, Susan had already made up her mind long before the public knew anything. Whatever relationship she had shared with David, emotional, professional, or fleetingly romantic, it ended the moment he betrayed her trust in print. What had been a tender, private chapter for her became, in his hands, a careless punchline. To him, it was a paragraph in a memoir. To her, it was the final straw. The quiet girl who once nursed a gentle crush was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned the cost of silence, and the power of walking away. Susan Dey learned the hard way how ugly fame and friendship could become. The moment David Cassidy's memoir hit shelves in 1994, everything changed. His descriptions of their past weren't just tasteless, they were cruel. He portrayed her as naive, almost pitiful, suggesting that her affection had been nothing more than a passing phase he barely tolerated. And worse, he made it painfully clear that she had never been what he wanted. She wasn't wild enough, wasn't exciting enough. In just a few dismissive sentences, he didn't just rewrite their history, he stripped it of its dignity. What may have once felt sacred to her was now reduced to something shameful. Susan Dey never responded publicly. She didn't call reporters, didn't issue a statement, and didn't take to the airwaves to defend herself. But privately, behind closed doors, she had something to say. According to a longtime friend from the Partridge Family days, Susan had been deeply hurt, not just by the memoir, but by the years of subtle disrespect that had led up to it. And when asked what she thought of David's version of events, she didn't mince words. "He was disgusting," she said. Just 2 words, but they spoke volumes. It wasn't petty, and it wasn't said for revenge. It came from a deep, long-standing wound that had never been allowed to heal. Those who knew her best understood, she didn't use words like that lightly. Susan had once admired David, maybe even loved him in the way that young people do, fully, freely, without defense. But that trust was shattered. What he wrote wasn't just a betrayal, it was a complete reduction of what she had experienced, and to her, it was unforgivable. This is what she had been hiding all those years on the set of the Partridge Family. While she smiled for cameras, hit her marks, and played America's teenage sweetheart, she was also quietly falling apart inside. She adored David from inches away, covering up a slow emotional unraveling that no one ever saw. She stitched herself back together when no one was looking, and through it all never let it show. But years later, when the truth finally surfaced, when she uttered those 4 blunt syllables, "He was disgusting," everything came into clearer focus. Her absence from reunions suddenly made sense. Her refusal to speak publicly about the show wasn't just about moving on, it was about self-preservation. It was about holding on to whatever dignity she still had after being reduced to a footnote in someone else's sensationalized story. For years, fans asked the same questions. Why wouldn't Susan Dey come back? Why didn't she reminisce about the show that made her famous? Why did she cut ties with everyone but Shirley Jones? The answer was painfully simple. Some memories don't fade, some scars don't soften with time, and some truths, once revealed, can never be taken back. David Cassidy may have thought he was adding a juicy chapter to his life story, but for Susan Dey, that chapter marked the end of it all. There would be no more appearances, no more forgiveness, just silence and the quiet weight of a truth she had carried for decades. After the memoir's release and Susan's quiet condemnation, there was no turning back. Any possibility of reconciliation between the two stars evaporated. It wasn't just a falling out, it was permanent emotional damage. What had once been a complicated but functioning working relationship turned into a complete void. No phone calls, no letters, no reunion appearances, just an intentional absence that grew louder with each passing year. The television industry thrives on nostalgia. Cast reunions, anniversary specials, throwback interviews, they all sell. But no matter how often the Partridge Family was celebrated, something always felt missing. Susan Dey never showed up. Not for tribute episodes. Not for televised specials. Not even when others returned to remember the show's legacy. Her silence became the most powerful statement of all. Retrospectives came and went, but Susan Dey never returned, not even when David Cassidy himself showed up for interviews fans hoped might finally bridge the years-long silence. Her seat remained empty, and with each passing appearance she declined, her absence grew louder. Speculation swirled. Some claimed she had simply moved on. Others suggested she was being difficult, distancing herself from the teenage image that had once defined her. But those who understood what really happened behind the scenes knew the truth. Susan's absence had nothing to do with ego or image. It had everything to do with broken trust, trust shattered so publicly that no performance could ever repair it. David, for his part, never fully acknowledged the pain he caused. In later interviews, he admitted to some regret, about Susan, about others he had hurt, but he never offered a direct apology to her, at least not in public. He confessed that fame had consumed him, that he had often acted selfishly, but the words that might have healed things never came. And without them, there was nothing to fix. The damage had taken root long ago and grown too deep to untangle. Susan, meanwhile, built a life beyond the Partridge Family. She redefined her career with LA Law, earning critical acclaim and a Golden Globe for her role as Grace Van Owen. It was a powerful second act, proof that she was far more than the quiet girl next to the teen idol. But even as her star rose, she never leaned into fame the way David did. She kept her life private, her interviews rare, and her thoughts on the Partridge Family virtually non-existent. When David Cassidy's health began to decline in the 2010s, public sentiment softened. Fans remembered the charm, the music, the teenage dreams he had inspired. But Susan Dey said nothing. No public tribute. No warm farewell. No final words. When Cassidy passed away in 2017, she remained silent, just as she always had. Some called it cold. Others finally understood. Viewers often forget that on-screen chemistry doesn't always mirror real-life harmony. The magic they saw every week was the result of professionalism, not affection. And once that professional trust was broken, there was nothing left to fake. Susan had done her job. She had kept her pain hidden and her silence intact, even when it would have been easier to speak out. But in her case, silence became a form of self-protection, a shield from gossip, distortion, and further hurt. This wasn't a dramatic celebrity feud, full of tabloid headlines and TV tell-alls. It was a quiet collapse. It began with a teenage crush, spiraled into rejection, and ended with a betrayal printed for all the world to see. While David continued sharing his version of the past, Susan buried hers, letting only a few trusted words slip, only when no spotlight could twist them. By then, it was too late for reconciliation. Whatever bond had once existed was gone, and the distance she maintained became part of her identity, not as a bitter ex-co-star, but as someone who chose peace over performance. By the time the dust had settled, the Partridge Family was cemented in pop culture history. For viewers, it remained a feel-good memory, a colorful snapshot of a simpler time. But beneath the glossy reruns and nostalgic playlists, the legacy of the show carried a fracture that never healed. At the heart of that divide were Susan Dey and David Cassidy, two stars whose connection looked perfect on screen but quietly fell apart behind it. For David, the show was both a blessing and a burden. He struggled with being typecast, resented the bubblegum image that clung to him, and spent much of his adult life trying to redefine himself. His personal battles with addiction and the pressures of fame played out in public. Still, in his later years, he embraced the show, often speaking fondly of the fans and the opportunities it gave him. But one topic he rarely, ever touched, was Susan. Susan Dey never addressed the matter directly, but her silence spoke volumes. While David Cassidy continued to revisit the Partridge Family through interviews, memoirs, and reunion appearances, Susan took an entirely different path. She stepped away from it all. No reunion tours, no tell-all interviews, no nostalgic nods to the role that launched her into stardom. For her, the Partridge Family wasn't just a chapter she had outgrown, it was a story she had chosen to close. Many assumed her absence was a simple career decision, a natural move for an actress eager to avoid being typecast. But those who knew the real story understood it was something far more personal. The tension between Susan and David eventually became part of the show's mythology. Fans wondered aloud why she never came back, why she seemed to erase the show from her public life. The answer, hidden behind years of professionalism and guarded privacy, lay in one unforgettable wound. The betrayal Susan felt after David's memoir wasn't just emotional, it was transformative. It reshaped the way she remembered the entire experience. There had been no explosive confrontation, no dramatic scene captured by the press, only a long, slow erosion of trust. And in the end, the final blow came not from an argument, but from words printed in a book, David's casual dismissal of a moment that had once meant something to her. Privately, Susan called him disgusting, a word that captured decades of disappointment in a single breath. It wasn't bitterness that kept her away. It was heartbreak. For Susan, the Partridge Family had once been sacred, a rare and cherished moment in her life. But once that intimacy was reduced to gossip, returning to it felt impossible. So she drew a line. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. When David Cassidy passed away in 2017, tributes poured in from co-stars, musicians, and devoted fans who remembered his charm and lasting impact on television. Susan, however, remained silent. That silence wasn't cruel. It was her way of preserving her truth. It was her quiet boundary between a past that hurt and a present she had worked hard to protect. In that choice, she spoke more powerfully than any public statement ever could. The legacy of the Partridge Family is one of contrast, joyful harmony on screen, quiet tension behind the scenes. The truth Susan Dey kept hidden for so long changed everything. And once it came to light, the show could never quite feel the same again. It raises a haunting question. If the truth about Susan and David's relationship had emerged during the show's peak, would the Partridge Family still be remembered as fondly? Or would the illusion of perfection that fans clung to have shattered long before the final episode ever aired?